Today, we're cracking open a really fascinating and pretty provocative book from the 19th century called The Ancient Church. Its author, W.D. Killen, basically argued that the early Christian church took a massive detour, straying way off from its original path. So let's dig in and see exactly how he builds that case.
Right there. That one sentence is the bombshell at the heart of Killen's entire book. He isn't just saying the church got bigger. He's claiming it completely changed its very identity, that it lost the original blueprint. He's essentially arguing that the church many people know today is not the one the apostles actually founded. I mean, that is a huge claim, and it's the mystery he's trying to solve.
So, Killen's whole argument hinges on this idea of an ecclesiastical revolution. He believes that over the first 300 years, all these man-made ideas, new leadership roles, new ceremonies, things the apostles never even mentioned, started creeping in. And he argues that they ended up corrupting the church's original, much simpler design. Let's trace how he says this all went down. Now, to really get this revolution, Killen says we have to set the stage first. His point is, you can't possibly grasp the arrival of Christianity without understanding the world it was born into, the Roman Empire, right at the absolute pinnacle of its power. Look at this. This little coin represents an almost unimaginable amount of power. Killen points out that Augustus Caesar ruled over something like 100 million people. To put that in perspective, that's more than a third of the planet's entire population back then. The world was connected in a way it had never, ever been before. But here's the twist. Killen argues this empire was a total paradox. On one hand, you had all these strengths that made it the perfect environment for a new idea to just take off. I mean, you've got unity, roads, common languages. It's a communications network. But on the other hand, its weaknesses created this deep, desperate hunger for a new message. Killen paints a picture of a society just riddled with corruption and moral decay, where the old gods and philosophies just weren't cutting it anymore. And this really gets to the core of it. What Killen is saying here is that for all the amazing art and literature and philosophy we celebrate from that era, society was, from his point of view, basically rotting from the inside out. Being smart wasn't enough to save it. He describes this profound spiritual emptiness, a real hunger for something more meaningful. So, into this massive, contradictory world, Killen introduces what he calls the original blueprint. This is the life of Jesus Christ, which he holds up as the pure, uncorrupted model that the later church would, in his view, eventually abandon. So, we zoom in. The grand stage of the Roman Empire shrinks all the way down to this tiny little corner of the map, Palestine. From a world-spanning empire to this small slice of land, this is where it all begins. What Killen really emphasizes here is just how remarkably humble and, short this life was. Born in obscurity, raised in a town nobody respected, a public career that lasted only about 3 years, and then an execution as a criminal followed by his resurrection. When you look at it that way, it's an incredibly unlikely start for a movement that would literally change the course of human history. Okay, this is a detail that Killen just zeroes in on. He finds it incredibly significant that the people who wrote the Gospels, people who actually knew Jesus, never once tell us what he looked like. Not his height, not his hair color, nothing. Killen argues this was on purpose, to force all future generations to focus not on the man's appearance, but on his character and his teachings. All right, next, Killen takes a very close look at the first followers, and he has this really specific, symbolic take on the first missionaries that becomes absolutely crucial for his argument against the church hierarchies that came later. We all know this image, right? The 12 apostles, the inner circle. But for W.D. Killen's argument, these guys are only half the story. So this is the key. For Killen, it's a huge deal that Christ sent out 2 different groups. The 12, their number, he argues, was symbolic, matching the 12 tribes of Israel. They represented the mission to the Jewish people. But then Christ appointed a second, larger group, the 70. Killen points out that in Jewish tradition, the world was made up of 70 heathen or Gentile nations. So this group symbolized the universal mission to the rest of the world. They weren't a top-down hierarchy, they were parallel symbols of a 2-part mission. And this symbolic interpretation leads to one of Killen's most radical conclusions. He's saying that if the apostles were just symbols, not the beginning of a chain of command, then the whole idea of apostolic succession, this belief that authority gets passed down directly from the apostles through an unbroken line of bishops, is just wrong. For Killen, the true test of a minister isn't who ordained them, it's their character, their actions, their results. Or as the quote says, you'll know them by their fruits.
So, with all of that groundwork laid, Killen finally gets to the main event, the revolution itself. And he pinpoints the very first seeds of this massive change to the days right after Christ's ascension.
It started with an absolute explosion of growth. On one single day, the day of Pentecost, the church in Jerusalem grew by 3,000 people. Now, that's incredible, but it's also a logistical nightmare. That sudden massive wave of new believers created an immediate crisis. Killen basically describes it as a domino effect. First, everyone starts spontaneously sharing their stuff, but that leads to a problem. The Greek-speaking widows were getting forgotten in the daily handouts. So, to solve this very practical, human problem, the community elects 7 guys to manage the charity. And right there, Killen points to that moment. The first new church office, the deacon, was created not because of some divine command, but out of simple human necessity. For him, this was the very first seemingly innocent step in a revolution that would eventually build a complex, multi-layered hierarchy that looked nothing like the original plan. And that really brings us back to the historian himself. W.D. Killen's book is this incredibly detailed, powerful argument, but it also forces us to think about the lens through which all history is written, and it leaves us with this final lingering question. How do an author's own deeply held beliefs shape the very way they see and tell the stories of the past?